What if everything you believed about God, about where morality comes from, about why humans are religious, about what happens when we die, was simply wrong? In 2006, a British biologist sat down and wrote a book that didn't just question those beliefs. It went on the offensive. It called belief in God a delusion, not a spiritual mystery, not a matter of personal faith, a persistent false belief held in the face of strong, contradictory evidence. That book was The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. It became a global bestseller, sparked fierce debate across religion, science, and philosophy, and helped launch an entire cultural movement known as the New Atheism. Today, we're breaking it all down: the arguments, the controversy, and why this book still matters nearly 20 years later. Let's get into it. Before we get into the book, you need to know who wrote it. Richard Dawkins is a British evolutionary biologist and ethologist, basically, a scientist who studies animal behavior and the mechanisms of evolution. He's been a professor at Oxford University and is one of the most recognizable scientists alive today. But Dawkins wasn't always a controversial public figure. His earlier work was largely celebrated within science. His 1976 book, The Selfish Gene, introduced the world to the concept of the meme. Yes, that kind of meme, as a unit of cultural transmission, analogous to a gene. His 1986 book, The Blind Watchmaker, argued powerfully that evolution by natural selection can fully explain the apparent design we see in living things. No creator required. By the early 2000s, Dawkins had long wanted to write a book directly criticizing religion. His publisher initially talked him out of it, but after what Dawkins called 4 years of Bush, referring to George W. Bush's faith-driven foreign policy, and with authors like Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens already making waves with similar books, the moment had finally arrived. In October 2006, The God Delusion hit shelves. The book has 464 pages across 10 chapters, and Dawkins lays out his mission clearly from the start. He says the book carries 4 central messages. 1. Atheists can be happy, balanced, moral, and intellectually fulfilled people. Atheism is not nihilism. 2. Science, specifically natural selection and evolution, is a far better explanation for the living world than any God hypothesis. 3. Children should not be labeled by their parents' religion. Dawkins argues that calling a child a Catholic child or a Muslim child is as strange as calling them a Marxist child, because children are simply too young to have formed those kinds of worldviews themselves. 4. Atheists should be proud, not apologetic. According to Dawkins, atheism is a sign of a healthy, independent, critical mind. The book opens with a chapter called A Deeply Religious Non-Believer, where Dawkins draws a crucial distinction. He separates what he calls Einsteinian religion, the poetic, awe-inspired sense of wonder that scientists like Einstein and Stephen Hawking sometimes expressed, from supernatural religion, which involves a personal God who intervenes in human affairs. Dawkins has no problem with the first. It's the second that he takes direct aim at. The core of Dawkins' argument rests on what he calls the God hypothesis, the idea that there exists a supernatural creator who designed the universe and takes a personal interest in human beings. Dawkins frames the entire debate like a scientific question. He argues that the existence of God is not just a matter of faith, it's a testable hypothesis about the nature of reality. He then presents 2 competing explanations for why the universe appears so complex and seemingly designed. Explanation 1. A designer exists, a supremely intelligent being who created everything. Explanation 2. From simple origins, complexity can emerge naturally over time, through processes like evolution, physics, and chemistry. Dawkins argues forcefully that explanation 2 not only works, it actually wins. Why? Because explanation 1 is self-defeating. Here's the logic, which Dawkins calls the ultimate Boeing 747 gambit. If you explain the universe's complexity by pointing to an all-knowing, all-powerful God, You've just introduced something even more complex and improbable than the thing you were trying to explain. Who designed the designer? The designer hypothesis doesn't solve the problem, it just kicks it one level up. He also dedicates significant time to dismantling the classic arguments for God's existence. The famous 5 ways of the medieval theologian Thomas Aquinas, cosmological arguments about first causes and prime movers, are addressed and dismissed. Dawkins applies Occam's razor. The simplest explanation that makes the fewest assumptions is most likely correct, and a godless universe requires far fewer assumptions than one with an omnipotent creator. He also tackles the God of the gaps argument, the idea that wherever science can't yet explain something, God must be the answer. Dawkins points out that as science advances, these gaps keep shrinking. It's a dangerous place to put your faith. One of the book's most interesting sections asks a question that makes a lot of religious people uncomfortable. Do we actually need God to be good? Dawkins says no, and he has a scientific explanation for morality. He argues that human beings evolved altruistic instincts through natural selection. Genes that encouraged cooperation and empathy spread through populations because they helped groups survive. Morality isn't handed down from heaven, it grew from the bottom up through evolution. To illustrate this, Dawkins points to what he calls the moral zeitgeist, a kind of slowly shifting moral consensus that evolves across human civilization. If you look at history, you'll notice that human sense of what is right and wrong has changed dramatically over centuries. Slavery was once widely accepted. Women were denied basic rights. Today, most of the world finds both deeply wrong. This moral evolution, Dawkins argues, doesn't come from Scripture, it comes from us. And interestingly, it's often ahead of Scripture. Religious leaders end up reinterpreting their holy texts to match the prevailing moral consensus of the time, not the other way around. On the flip side, Dawkins goes on the offensive against religion's negative contributions to society. He argues that religion has been used to justify violence and warfare, encourage fanaticism, foster bigotry toward LGBT+ people, and divide communities into hostile in-groups and out-groups. He's particularly critical of religious education for children, which he views as a form of indoctrination, teaching children what to believe before they're old enough to evaluate the evidence for themselves. The book closes by asking whether, despite all of this, religion still serves a purpose, giving people comfort, community, and meaning. Dawkins' answer is that science and philosophy can fill that role far better, and that atheism, rather than being bleak, actually opens the door to a richer understanding of the universe. Now here's where it gets really interesting, because the reaction to this book was enormous, and not all of it was positive, even from people who agreed with Dawkins' conclusions. The book was nominated for Best Book at the British Book Awards, where Dawkins was named Author of the Year. It reached number 4 on the New York Times bestseller list and was translated into 35 languages. By August 2007, it was Amazon's top-selling book in the religion and spirituality category, which is wonderfully ironic. But the critics came swinging from all directions. Oxford theologian Alistair McGrath, himself a former atheist with a PhD in molecular biophysics, argued that Dawkins fundamentally misunderstands Christian theology and sets up a version of religious belief that most sophisticated believers wouldn't actually recognize. He wrote a direct response called The Dawkins Delusion? Literary critic Terry Eagleton, writing in the London Review of Books, accused Dawkins of targeting a simplistic, Sunday school version of God rather than engaging with the serious theological tradition. Even fellow atheist philosophers thought Dawkins was punching at straw men. Philosopher Thomas Nagel, despite being a non-believer himself, wrote that Dawkins underestimates the genuine intellectual difficulty of the questions he's tackling. And philosopher Keith Ward specifically argued that Dawkins misrepresented Aquinas' 5 ways, attributing arguments to Thomas Aquinas that Aquinas never actually made. There was even legal trouble. In Turkey, where the book sold thousands of copies, a court case was launched against the Turkish publisher for allegedly insulting religious values. In April 2008, The publisher was acquitted, with the judge ruling that banning the book would fundamentally limit the freedom of thought. Whatever you think of Dawkins' arguments, the cultural impact of the God Delusion is undeniable. The book helped define the new atheism movement, a more confrontational, unapologetic brand of atheism that refuses to treat religious belief as off-limits from criticism. Alongside Sam Harris's The End of Faith and Christopher Hitchens's God is Not Great, it shifted the public conversation around religion in a meaningful way. It gave millions of people, many of whom had quietly doubted their faith for years, the vocabulary and the confidence to articulate those doubts. It told them they weren't alone. And it pushed back hard against the idea that skepticism toward religion is somehow rude, immoral, or dangerous. Critics will tell you Dawkins is too combative, too reductive, too quick to dismiss millennia of theological thought. And honestly, some of those criticisms have merit. The book is more effective as a passionate polemic than as a rigorous philosophical treatise. But as a starting point, as a provocation that forces you to actually examine what you believe and why you believe it, The God Delusion remains one of the most important popular science books of the 21st century. So that's The God Delusion, a bold, controversial, and genuinely thought-provoking book that refuses to treat the biggest question in human history as anything other than fair game for evidence and reason. Whether you end up agreeing with Dawkins or not, the questions he raises are worth sitting with. If you found this video helpful, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into landmark books and big ideas. Drop your thoughts in the comments, especially if you've read the book yourself. I'll see you in the next one.